Good evening. Welcome to Horizon. I'm Michael Grant. Larry actually would not have a job if it wasn't for the man we're going to talk about next. For many in the House of Representatives, the Senate is seen as the next step up the ladder, but Arizona Representative John Rhodes didn't have that ambition. He wanted to be the man of the House, the Speaker. That's part of the title of a new biography of him, John Rhodes, Man of the House. It was written by his former press aide, J. Bryan Smith. We'll talk to Jay, but first, here's a look at Rhodes' life.
John Rhodes was born in Council Grove, Kansas on September 18, 1916. After attending school in his hometown, he got an undergraduate degree from Kansas State University and a law degree from Harvard. In September of 1941, he was called up to active duty in the military. Rhodes was assigned to the Army Air Corps Advanced Flying School in Higley, Arizona. In 1946, Rhodes bought a house in Mesa for he and his wife, Elizabeth, where, besides Washington, D.C., he would live for the rest of his life. Rhodes started a career as a lawyer and also opened a successful insurance company. He became active in the community and was soon drafted by former Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater to run for Arizona Attorney General, a race he lost in a heavily Democratic state. In 1952, he ran for Congress and won, becoming the first Republican ever elected to Congress from Arizona. In 1968, the bill creating the Central Arizona Project was signed into law, and Rhodes was a key in its passage. 6 years later, Rhodes was one of three men, including Senator Goldwater, who informed President Nixon that his chances of avoiding impeachment were not good. Here is Rhodes just a day before that meeting talking about how he would vote on impeachment.
The principle is no person, whether he be rich or poor, black or white, ordinary citizen or president, is above the law. Cover-up of criminal activity and misuse of federal agencies can neither be condoned nor tolerated. And as long as we adhere as a nation to this principle, our nation will remain great and strong. I've considered all of the evidence to the best of my ability. When the roll is called in the House of Representatives, I will vote aye on impeachment Article 1.
Although he wanted to be, Rhodes never got to be Speaker of the House during his 30-year tenure. Here's Rhodes sparring with former House Speaker Tip O'Neill.
And don't hide behind the fact that you didn't know this bill was coming along. It's been 4 months out there in the offering.
Well, is this the result of all of the combined wisdom of the Democratic Party? I'll yield to Speaker in 1 minute, but not...
Rhodes passed away on August 24th, 2003.
Here now to tell us more about his book, John Rhodes, the Man of the House, is J. Bryan Smith. Jay served as press secretary to Rhodes in the 1970s. Jay, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Michael.
You know, it really is appropriate that we would be talking to the Deputy General Manager of the Central Arizona Project right before I talk to you, because he was key in getting the Central Arizona Project for Arizona.
He certainly was. If you go back and talk to and read about all of the significant players, realizing that the Central Arizona Project took decades to come to fruition. Many individuals worked their whole adult lifetimes to get it passed. And Carl Hayden worked on it, strenuously for years and years and years. And there were lawsuits and court cases, and finally the Supreme Court got involved. But it had never been discharged from the House Interior Committee, never.
Because the then chairman was opposed to it.
Strongly opposed to it. A congressman from Colorado named Wayne Espinal. And the book tells the story of how John Rhodes used some very clever parliamentary tactics and his knowledge of the rules of the House to basically outfox the chairman of the House Interior Committee and bring it to the floor, and it passed by a voice vote.
And a little animosity, too, between the then Speaker and Mr. Aspinall.
Yeah, the then Speaker of the House, John McCormick from Massachusetts, was not very fond of Wayne Aspinall, so he granted Rhodes' request for a special rule, which was rare, whereby a member could not get up and object to an appropriations measure.
You know, Jay, it's a terrific book, and one of the things that I really liked about it is you pay a lot of attention to the state's political history in the late 1940s and the 1950s, and even some of us who have been around for a while. It filled in a lot of details, including but not limited to, I never knew that John Rhodes' 1956 opponent was Bill Mahoney, the father of the former Secretary of State.
Right. John called Bill Mahoney his toughest opponent, and that's because he was Maricopa County attorney, so in effect, John's constituents had voted him into office, so he was very popular in Maricopa County. He was a very fine gentleman, very intelligent, and he had heavy backing from organized labor. So John didn't take him lightly at all. It was a race.
Tell a story about the conversation between Barry Goldwater and John Rhodes in 1950 involving he was encouraging John Rhodes to run for Attorney General.
Well, John used to tell this story all the time, that he was sitting in his law office in Mesa one day, and his secretary said, "There's a Mr. Goldwater on the line for you." And he picked up the phone, and Barry Goldwater introduced himself and said that he was going to manage the gubernatorial campaign of Howard Pyle, and that he had decided that they wanted to draft John Rhodes to run for Attorney General. And John apparently said, "Well, Mr. Goldwater, there's something you need to know. I don't want to be Attorney General." And Barry Goldwater said, "Don't worry, you won't be."
because of the overwhelming Democratic registration.
4-to-1 Democratic registration edge in those days.
And in fact, if I recall correctly, he went on to lose that race.
Oh,
what about 65-35? Is that somewhere in there?
He got smeared.
But it set the platform.
Well, he was smart. He had ambitions to run for Congress, and you have to start somewhere. And he felt that if he had ran for Attorney General, and knowing that he would lose, but if he beat the point spread a little bit, he'd have a leg up for a nomination for candidacy for the Congress, which he did 2 years later. And he was the first Republican ever elected in the state of Arizona to the United States House of Representatives.
You know, when I read that story about the conversation between Barry Goldwater and John Rhodes, I immediately then went to roughly 25 years later, when the two of them from a small state of Arizona were walking over to see Richard Nixon the day before he resigned, to kind of give him their best assessment on just how bad off he was in the Congress. They
went down Pennsylvania Avenue to meet with the president and essentially tell him that the game was over, that he didn't have any support in Congress, that he would be impeached. And it was the next day that Nixon announced to the nation that he would resign rather than be impeached.
And, you know, I have always heard, Jay, that although Hugh Scott was also involved in that, the Senate Minority Leader from Pennsylvania, that Nixon was really looking to Goldwater and Rhodes, because Scott was more the Rockefeller wing of the Republican Party, and Nixon thought he'd get a straighter shot from Senator Goldwater and Congressman Rhodes.
Well, certainly, Scott had to be there because he was the Senate Minority Leader, but, you know, for obvious reasons, Richard Nixon was not in a very good mood in that meeting, because that day's Washington Post, and in fact, most major newspapers had on the front page, "Rhodes will vote to impeach." So he had a little edge to his voice when he turned to John and said, "I know how you feel." And you know, John said, "Yes, that's true, Mr. President." And he said, what do you think? I have 15 votes in the House?" And John told the story that in his mind he was thinking, "Oh, you have more than that. You have about 50 or 60." But he didn't want to say that to give him Nixon that kind of encouragement. So he just kind of held his tongue, and then Nixon turned to Barry and said, "What's the situation in the Senate?"
In the Senate. Yeah. He struggled with Watergate. You've got a quote in there that from him that says basically you can't impeach someone for being an expletive. But he struggled quite a bit with that issue.
He agonized over it, and that word was used frequently in reporting of him during that year, because, you know, it was easy for the people that were, you know, against Nixon from the start, and it was easy for the people who would support Nixon no matter what.
Right.
But the vast majority, you know, were troubled by the charges, and as the evidence came out, even more troubled, and they had to wrestle with the facts. And John Rhodes was one of those. He resisted the pressure, significant pressure from, you know, people in his party to support Nixon blindly.
No matter what.
But he happened to believe that this was not a partisan matter, even though the president was a Republican, and that the Constitution came first, and that the process had to work. And And, you know, he probably did more to make it possible for Nixon's opponents to successfully get to that stage because of who he was and the position that he had when he would say publicly, you know, the White House has to release the tapes. Mm-hmm. That was a body blow to the Republican White House. But he did it because he believed that the Constitution was more important than political parties.
I think that kind of sums up John Rhodes. Jay Smith, terrific and excellently researched.
Thank you.
And we appreciate you joining us.
Thank you for having me.